that I want to make with you today is a classic. It's one of the things that I bring regularly to classes, meetings, doesn't matter where I go, I usually end up bringing this, and that is my pumpkin bread. So the really great thing about this pumpkin bread is that it is a one bowl preparation. That means we are simply going to add each ingredient one after another into the same bowl. Normally when you're dealing with breads and cakes, a lot of times you have to have separate bowls for wet and dry ingredients. This is one of those times where you won't need that. So not only is it super simple, it also freezes really well. So what I mean by that is if you take this batter and put it into a disposable loaf pan like I'm going to show you, you can freeze the loaf, and then when you're ready to use it, you can take it out of the freezer directly and put it into your oven at a lower temperature than you would if it were raw, and just give it more time and it will still bake and turn out wonderful. This is great if you ever want to make a lot of something and then go ahead and put it in your freezer, and then you can pop it out to impress friends and family whenever you need something fresh to bake. This is also one of the ways I'm able to provide so many baked goods on campus at such short notice. A lot of times people will tell me that they're coming to my office only, the night before that they're going to come. And so that enables me to pull something out of the freezer, bake it fresh, and make it wonderful and taste good, as if I had gotten up at 3 a.m. and made it that morning. So let's go ahead and get started about how to assemble this pumpkin loaf.
All right, so we're about ready to start with our pumpkin loaf. But what I first wanted to talk about was the kind of hardware that we're going to be using, if you will, to create our pumpkin loaf. So I'll be using a stand mixer today. This is a KitchenAid Artisan stand mixer. I actually bought it for myself as a graduation present when I graduated with my bachelor's degree. And that was a momentous occasion for me because I actually dropped out of school and ended up coming back many years later. So I like a KitchenAid Artisan because it has a handle attachment on the bowl, which makes it a lot easier to move large amounts of material. It also has a little bit larger bowl, rather than going with, say, a smaller KitchenAid or one of the larger sort of professional grade ones. So on stand mixers, there are three main types of attachments that you can use. So the first one, and the most commonly used, and one we're going to use today, is this. This is called a paddle attachment. A paddle attachment is pretty much used for everything that you would think of as far as mixing goes. So this is things like cookies, cakes, loaves of bread like this. You're going to use the paddle attachment. So this is like if you would use a spoon if you were hand mixing something. Okay, so that's the paddle attachment. Now a lot of people get confused and they think they should use this. This is what's called a whisk attachment. So a whisk attachment is designed for whisking things. Obviously, it's in the name. But if you would be using a handheld whisk, so beating something like egg whites for a meringue and you're trying to get it super frothy, or say whipping cream into whipped cream, homemade whipped cream, instead of buying it pre-made, which, by the way, if you've never done that, I would highly suggest it. It's super easy to do. So if you use something like this for cookies, or even the loaf that we're going to do today, this will break really easily on you. It might last for a couple batches, but this is not designed to move through thick batters. This is designed, again, to whisk up light, frothy things. Okay? So the last one is a dough hook. So a dough hook is designed to be able to move around and beat dough into a dough ball. If you're going to be creating something like bread or rolls, this is kind of your go-to attachment for making those. So we're not going to be using the whisk or the dough hook today. We instead are going to be focusing on using our paddle attachment. So I'm going to go ahead and attach this. Now, I will say, if you don't have a stand mixer, you're totally fine. You don't need to run out and buy a $400 stand mixer, or $200, or however much they are now. I don't know. You're totally fine if you have just a spoon and a bowl. Or if you have a handheld mixer, you can sometimes pick those up on sale at Walmart for like $5. That's totally worth your time, or sometimes even cheaper than that if you can find them at a resale shop. If you have a handheld mixer, if you have a spoon, and you're just using like this hand mixer, that's totally fine too. All that will work. It's just I'm going to be cooking a lot of things, and so it's easier for me to use my stand mixer. Now, what do I have in my bowl right now? So we've started out with 3 cups of sugar. Now, I know that sounds like a lot of sugar, and it is a lot of sugar, but we're going to be getting several loaves out of this one batch. Because remember, one of the things I told you that I love about these pumpkin loaves is that I can get a lot of loaves and then freeze them and then bake them from frozen. So we're starting out with 3 cups of sugar, and we're going to add 1 cup of vegetable oil. Now I'm going to bring this down and go ahead and lock it into place for safety, and then put it on a slow mix. Okay, so I brought it off of the slow mix, and it's come together, and it's kind of hard to see, but this looks just like wet sand. So super easy to kind of tell that you're at the right place. We've found this wet sand consistency. That means you are doing things correctly. Okay. Next, we're going to add 4 eggs. So once your 4 eggs have been completely mixed in, we're going to go ahead and move to our next ingredient. And that's actually our pumpkin. I'll be using 1 can of prepared pumpkin. Now it's important to note this is not pumpkin pie mix. You'll find both at the store. Pumpkin pie mix has a lot of other things in it as well. We want just 100% pure canned pumpkin. Now I will say that I have made like pumpkin pie and pumpkin loaf from actually a pumpkin. There's a specific type of pumpkin you use called sugar pumpkins or baking pumpkins. But the deal with those is that this recipe will be altered quite a bit because sugar pumpkins and pie pumpkins and baking pumpkins, all kind of the same thing there, they tend to be a little bit more wet when you're working with them than like say this canned material. And so because they're more wet, you have to reduce down the liquid in other parts of the ingredient to kind of balance out the equation, if you will. Otherwise, you're going to end up with this really soupy mess that's not going to turn into the pumpkin loaf that you're wanting. So we're going to put this entire can in there. Looks pretty well integrated right there. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add 2 teaspoons of baking soda, 1 teaspoon of baking powder, and 2 teaspoons of salt. Salt is one of those ingredients that's super important, and I would highly recommend buying good quality salt. So, I mean, it doesn't need to be like, I don't know, $10 a box or anything, but I wouldn't buy the cheapest thing you can find. Salt is the ingredient that makes everything taste like itself. And if you don't believe me, go ahead and cook something for yourself, like a piece of chicken or anything, really any vegetables, and without any sort of salt on them whatsoever, and then add a little bit of salt afterwards, and you're going to notice the chicken tastes more like chicken, or the asparagus tastes more like asparagus in the presence of salt. And that simply has to do with the way that our taste buds work. So I'm going to go ahead and add those 3 ingredients, and then mix to combine. That looks good. So next I'm going to be adding 1 tablespoon of pumpkin pie spice and 1 teaspoon of cinnamon. Now, pumpkin pie spice is just a conglomeration of a lot of other spices, things like clove, allspice, nutmeg is in there. Now, normally I'm pretty much a purist as far as spices go. So if I'm going to use nutmeg, I'm going to get like an actual nutmeg nut, and I'm going to actually grate it on a small rasp and get fresh ground nutmeg. For these particular loaves, it makes a difference, but not as big of a difference as I have noticed in other things. So I've just gone with kind of a pre-mixed, pre-ground spice here. So I'm going to add that and mix it. All right, so next I'm going to add 2/3 of a cup of water. Now, you're probably thinking, why am I adding water? This already looks pretty soupy, and it is pretty soupy at this point. But we're getting ready to add a whole bunch of flour. And I've experimented with this recipe before and removed the water, and it has made drastic consequences on the final product. All right, so I'm using water right now. This is what the original recipe calls for. It works pretty well. What I've also done at this stage is 2/3 of a cup of almond milk, or I have done 2/3 of a cup of milk, just regular milk. And that has also worked well, and those have yielded a little bit more rich product. You just have to be careful that you're watching out for any sort of dairy allergy or nut allergy at that point. And so, because normally this sort of recipe wouldn't call for that. So I'm going to go ahead and add that water. All right, that looks great. So the last thing I'm going to add is 3 cups of flour. Now this is all-purpose flour. So we're going to talk later when we do breads and talk about different types of flour, such as pastry flour or bread flour. Basically, the big difference between the different types of flour and self-rising flour, self-rising flour is a little different because there's some extra ingredients in there. But between pastry flour, bread flour, and all-purpose flour, the main difference is going to be the amount of protein in the flour complex, and that will yield a very different texture when it's baked. So pastry flour tends to be really light and airy, and a little more flaky. Cake flour is the ultimate sort of lightness, like you're making angel food cake out of cake flour. And then bread flour will be the more dense. Think about bread kind of stands up. And so this is all purposed somewhere in the middle. I'm going to go ahead and only add about half of this 3 cups of flour right now. Now I'm going to go ahead and add the last half of the flour and mix slowly again so that I don't end up with flour all over my counter. All right, so once everything has been mixed together and it has a solid consistency, now we need to think about what type of pan are we going to move it to. Now you could just move this to a standard loaf pan, and that would totally work. What I would suggest if you're going to do that is to spray down the loaf pan with either a little bit of oil, like a little cooking oil, and then sprinkle some flour in there, shake it around until you kind of get a nice dust on the pan. That way the pumpkin loaf will come out really easily. Or they also sell kind of baking spray. It's right over by the cooking spray that has flour already in it, and you just spray the pan and wham, bam, thank you, ma'am, you're done. And so that will work really, really well. Now, I like to freeze these pumpkin loaves. So one of the things I do is I buy these little paper disposable pans that I can give to people with a baked pumpkin loaf inside. So let me show you what those look like. All right, so here are my paper baking pans. I got these off of Amazon. They're not very expensive. You can also get them other places if you don't want to buy like a ton of them. You can get them at Sam's Club. You can get them at Daiso, the dollar store. So there's lots of different places to get these. Now, what I'm going to do is I am going to spray these with a little bit of the cooking spray that has the flour in it, just because I want to make sure it does release really easily. And then I'm going to fill these up to about 2/3 to 3/4 full. You don't want them to go right to the top. If they go up to the top, they're going to overflow in the bottom of your oven, and that's not going to be good. So once we get these put in here, then we run into the question of what are we going to do with our loaves? Are we going to bake them right now, or are we going to wait for them to be baked? So if you're going to bake them right now, you need to put them in an oven that's been preheated to 350 degrees. And they'll go for about 40 minutes in there. I would probably set your timer for 30, and then what you can do is at 30 minutes, go ahead and stick a knife into the pumpkin loaf and pull it out and see if it's still raw. If you get kind of dough coming out of the knife, you know it needs more time. And then I would give it about 5 more minute increments after that. So check every 5 minutes and stick another knife in and see if it's done or not. If it pulls out and you still got this kind of dough consistency on there, then it's not done. Now, if you want to freeze these, you can fill it up, and then you can place them into either a zip top bag, or you could put foil around them, or you could put, I have a little vacuum sealing thing that I use, and then you can put them in the freezer. And they will stay in your freezer, if they're sealed really well, for about 6 months to a year. Then when you're ready to bake these, you'll take them directly out of the freezer and put them in a 300-degree oven for 1 hour and 15 minutes. At that point, it should thaw it all the way through. It's at a little bit lower temperature. Thaw it through and cook it. And you can test it by sticking that little knife in again, just to make sure that what you're pulling out is completely done. So let's go ahead and get this batter into some bowls. All right, so there you go, guys. Now these are ready to go into the oven. Go ahead and put them in, and they get either to the oven or to the freezer. Set that timer and make sure that you don't want to burn your loaf you spent so much time on. But the nice thing, like I said before, is that when you freeze these, you can kind of make some really cool presents for people. Or like I do, I can take a fresh baked good into a meeting, and it seems like I got up super early to do it, and I might have, but I got up early and just put it in the oven from the freezer. Which, again, it looks really impressive, but it's not really that hard to do. So I hope this was enjoyable for y'all, and enjoy the next episode of Bakespeare, which I believe will be about cookies. So I will see y'all there.